Could you tell us something of the Chinese in Rossland, Warren?
Yes, Jack, we had there was quite a number of Chinese in the early days of Roslyn. Down in Chinatown there was several stores, and they had their own associations, tongs, or whatever they might be known as. I wasn't familiar with their organizations. But they would come out, they had parades, and they had their bands, most consisting mostly of a lot of brass. But the Chinamen below, the Chinamen, then the gardens down below occupied quite an area, and those Chinamen, they were self-supporting. They did very well out of their gardens. They would grow these vegetables and bring uptown on two great big baskets with a pole between, and they'd visit house to house. That meant you had fresh vegetables every day. And they would go around and you could get your requirements in vegetables from the Chinamen. Their prices were always fair, and they did a considerable business. The most of the people them days, they run an account like the end of the month, and then at the end of the month they pay the Chinaman for what vegetables was, but you was always sure of your vegetables. The Chinese were a good race, the Chinese that were in Roslyn. There were never no trouble with the Chinese.
They used to keep the accounts on the door frames, didn't they?
Well, some places, yes. If they didn't have their little black book, they'd write it down anywhere, some of their right. The majority of people, though, I would say, they would have a little black book, and your name would be in there, and you would take out, and the Chinaman was to watch you doing. He wouldn't know what you were doing, but you were marking down the price of the goods that you bought. And then at payday come along, you would pay, total it up, and pay the Chinaman. He might have had other means. He'd take the black book too once in a while, possibly. I don't know who was doing the auditing. But there was, nobody was out to steal much from the Chinese. Us kids used to look forward to the Chinese, especially attending a Chinese burial. When the Chinaman died, it was all under the Chinese form of burial. One instance, they had a lot of paper with holes perforated through it, thousands and thousands of holes. And they would scatter this paper while the earth was being filled in around in the grave. And I think their theory was the devil had to go through each one of them holes before he could get the Mr. Man that was buried. But on top, what we glorified in, when the ground was fully covered and over the mound of the grave, they always used to leave a suckling pig and apples and candies and nuts. Well, we would be laying in the bushel waiting for the Chinese to get through with their burial. The moment they did, we pounced on the grave, and we used to come into some great feeds that way. Sometimes there was a few occasions, I think, Jack, that I think one time there was a family in Roslyn, names, I'm not going to mention any names, but they had a Chinese cook. And this fellow come out, I think he was going to school at the time, went over, their son anyway, in this household, went over and asked the Chinaman for a piece of pie, and the Chinaman says, no pie for you. So he went upstairs and got a gun and come down and shot the Chinaman. He did. That was one thing that happened in Roslyn. There was several instances that they were a little rough on the Chinamen, a few cases, but nothing for comparison with the mob population we had in Chinamen. But I would say the Chinamen were very beneficiary to the Roslyn people. They were really quite essential to have there. In that way, there's a lot of people got fresh vegetables. And they were quite the tillers of the soil. They got the good out of the soil. And you could get your potatoes, lay in your vegetables, even in the Chinamen that were a little better off in bigger organizations. They had a rig with a couple of horses. But the majority just would pack these tremendous big baskets on their shoulders all the way up that hill from China, from the gardens.
Do you remember that Chinese Masonic Hall?
Yes, yes, that was down Chinatown. That was quite a building. It was rather, of course, we didn't pay much, but the design of that stood out. It stands out in my mind today. It was rather an oddity as far as the design goes, something I was pursuing that like exists in their own country. A lot of dragons and different animals and long tails, and it was certainly, the animals were well exemplified on there. There were certainly whoever planned them buildings, and they'd get down there and you could hear them, especially if the band was practicing. Goodness, you could hear them all over town. For largely, as I was saying before, it consisted of brass. And the Chinamen used to go in. We used to get a light go down. The Chinamen would get in a lot of turtles. And us kids would get down. The Chinamen would let us ride on their backs of the turtles. You know?
These were big ones, right?
Yes, quite big ones, Jack, yes. The Chinamen, the reason the turtles were brought in, I know this now, the Chinamen, that is one of their source of medicine. They take these Chinamen, and certain sections of the of the turtles are used for that purpose, for medicine purposes. And they make kind of, I've seen it prepared. It's more like a jello, Jack. It's more jelly than, but they swear by it. And the same thing, now speaking about Chinamen, I shot a lot of bear in my days in Roslyn, for I used to get a lot of kick out of going hunting bear when and bear were destructful, in one sense of the word. They go down to Chinese gardens and they'll take a hill of turnips, or not a hill of parsnips or carrots, and they'll just strip that hill. They seem to take a carrot or a parsnip, and with their claw they'll split it down and then take that inside core. And fruit trees, they were most destructive. And the Chinaman would always, if I shot a bear, the gall was on the liver, and the bear's feet, always brought in a good price. Now they'd take, I know this, Jack, they would take them bear paws and boil them down. Absolutely boil all the meat free from all bones. Then they would take those bones, which is quite numerous in the feet or the hands, and they would take them bones, and they would buy the best alcohol that was good whiskey or anything, but a good alcoholic content. They'd take and open that and would put them bones in the bottle, cram that bottle full of these bones, and then reseal it tight and let it set for years. And then when that was their cure for rheumatics. And it seems feasible because all the marrow of the bone is in there with the alcohol. They've got a lot of customs that could stand a little tension, Jack. Yes. So that pretty well covers my Chinese. I don't know of anything else that I could.
They ran the laundries too, didn't they?
Yes, they did. They run the laundries. They'd go around and get your laundry. Sam Hop and they were in another field of adventure. Mark Hand, who was out past the White Bear at them days, up on top of Deer Park Mountain. He was a woodcutter. He would cut wood up there and bring it into Roslyn and sell the wood. He had a couple of nice team of horses. And I used to go out to his place quite a lot when I was a kid running around. Used to ride in his wagon and go out there. But never, tea and rice was their main diet, Jack, and never cared for anything like that. But
could you tell us something about the Red Mountain Railroad, Warren?
yes, well, the Red Mountain Railroad, what stands out in my mind more about them, of course, they were built into Roslyn. I think Corbin was somewhere responsible for the introduction of the railroad into the Roslyn area. Of course, Heights might have been the original instigator of it, but anyway, it was followed by Corbin, who was a railroad man. The possibilities were in existence in Roslyn. So what stands out in my mind, not so much, I remember we weren't very old at the time, that most of the mines that being operated in Roslyn was operated by U.S. capital. A lot of these investors seen the possibility, and they were more than anxious to invest their money. And after the mines were in production, they were arriving at such great profits from their investment, that they were quite numerous in Spokane. They would get and hire a special train consisting of 3 or 4 coaches and load those coaches with people that had money invested in Roslyn to come up there to take a look, see for themselves. And I can recall when these special trains would come in, we'd have an idea that the trains, we knew when the regular trains run, and this would be, so we'd all be flocked over to the station waiting the arrival of these trains. Goodness, when they come in, us kids were showered with candy and flags, American flags and candy, and whistles and all kinds of things that these people would bring up. So it used to be quite a heyday for us, and these people would get up, of course, and it wouldn't be long before they'd be mingled with the crowd. Well, a town that supported 32 saloons, you know where that recreation would be, mostly down in the bar, and they would have 2 or 3 glorious days. They'd have 2 or 3 days glorious day, mostly drunk, but nevertheless, us kids benefited great by it. But they enjoyed their stay there, and I wasn't the talk that would go on. I think there were some of the investors from Texas, and you know what Texas, they had everything bigger in Texas than we. Not kidding, but we used to look forward to those trains, and they would run several of those trains during the course of the summer. And of course, the smelter was then established at Northport, and it wasn't long before there was other people interested in the Roslyn properties. And these people their shares were acquired by Canadian interests, and then of course, the railroad started to build from our side, the CPR. The West Kootenai come in, and so we kind of termed it then as a Canadian organization, Canadian Endeavor, Jack.
Remember that big loop trestle on the Great Northern?
Yes, I well remember that, Jack. There was quite a feat. There was a trestle that stood out. It practically, it didn't make the complete circle, but I would say it made from pretty close to 70 or 80% of a complete circle, and that was built by bridgemen. Today we haven't those kind of men. They're not available. At these days, well, of course, blueprints did enter into it, but a man carried an awful lot of knowledge within his head, too. And tramways, where we used to have to transport a lot of our ores by tram off these steep incline hills. I remember we had one old chap, Al, he was a Swede Hornquist, I think. And he was the official, recognized the tramways. He'd go out and look over a piece of country and possibly paste it off, get the footage and look over the contour and say, well, trestle here, or a tower here, and a tower over there. And he'd go on mumbling to himself. And then he'd get a crew of men starting to build. To have no plan, had it all in his head. Be all right as long as keep the old fellow sober, but he used to go out and get drunk once in a while, and the jobs was held up. And I never forget him, for he had a heavy mustache and somewhat of a small, and he was quite a snooze chewer, and the snooze would be rolling down, these whiskers down onto his vest. And I can picture him now. I'll describe to you, Jack, but for a building, I don't know where he possessed it, but he could lay out trams. He laid out a good many of them right around here and in the Slocan. And Al never was far amiss on his calculations. Well, the men had to do it them days, Jack. We didn't have the engineering facilities we have today, but they were quite capable of meeting the emergency. Any emergency that come up, boy, they were well within their scope of knowledge to take care of it.
Well, before we pack it up today, I was going to ask you about the various groups that settled in town, like there was the Cornishmen, the Italians, and the Nova Scotians, and they lived in different parts
That's
of
right,
town.
Jack. We all had our different, there were different clans, and they would seem to get together like they, if they didn't come from the same place in the old country, they knew they were from the old country, and those people would get together. They felt as, and it's no more than right, they felt as if they had something in common, and that's the reason that they got together. There were a lot of these people out from European countries, well, even from Great Britain, that honestly, Jack, you couldn't understand them. They'd get talking in that, in Cousin Jack language, in Cornetian. Oh my God, it was so different from us. Us kids used to get it. I acquired it quite a lot of because we lived between two Cousin Jack families. And I used to eat their pasties and saffron bread, and I got as bad as them. A lot of people say, where are you from? What part of Cornish you from? You're a Cornishman. Well, just from living with them. And then one of my cousins, Annie, she married a Cousin Jack, Dick White. Well, I was raised in that environment, so I acquired some of that. But they were all good people. And the Finlanders, there was Finlanders and Swedes and Mountain Negroes. Oh, there was every nationality, Jack. But they all had their own little communities. But mind you, when they come up on Columbia Avenue, where the town was, they would mix with the other people and fight with the other people and drink with the other people. It all seemed to enter into the same. Drinking brings on fighting.
Do you recall which parts of town the various groups settled
Well,
in?
now we'll take where Mrs. Cole, well, my wife, her name was Coleman. That was up behind the War Eagle, and that was Newfoundland Hill. They called that Fish Alley. There was nothing lived in there but Newfoundlanders, and the names all stand out in my mind now. Well, they were a clan within themselves, but they used to have to come down and mingle with the other ones. Well, then we had a place down below, down on the lower part of Washington Street. There was Linda's Ranch, and there was 2 or 3 Swedish families down there. And I don't know, well, then up above on the other road, on the road going out to Jones's Ranch, there was no settlement, just the odd person here and there at the Sunset Mine out there, which Tommy Davidson was a caretaker. And then you'd come in, and the Cousin Jacks, I would say the Cousin Jacks, they would possibly be around the Nickel Plate area. And then over farther, you had the Lukars, the Heidler. They were the Swedes. They were over more behind the old Central School, over in that, where the Heidler boys live now. They were clannished over there. really, the way I got to know, after leaving, I got associated with Braden, who run a grocery store, and I delivered groceries, so I had a pretty good knowledge of these various people where they lived. You had to, because it was all delivering then by horse and wagon. But that's about. I can't recall any community where of any outside of the Swedes and the Finlanders and the Cousin Jacks, and the ladies were known as Cousin Ginnies, you know. Yeah, we had to have Cousin Ginnies with Cousin Jacks, or you couldn't know her. And the Fish Alley, that stands out. That was quite noted. That would be the most prominent of all, Jack, I would say.
They were all Nova Scotians, were they?
You know, they were Newfoundlanders.
Newfoundlanders.
Newfoundlanders, yes. The Nova Scotians, you weren't allowed there because you were from Nova Scotia. They were strictly all from Newfoundland there. Yes, I knew all of them very well.